This meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're going to get started here. It's 8 o'clock. Most everyone is in their seat. We'll give folks a chance to do whatever they need to do in the next few seconds. And I will see if our executive director has an announcement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, council members. Just by way of orientation of our agenda, we did finish off yesterday evening on E3. Given the short time between E3 and E8 that was on the agenda, we've elected to push back E8, which is further direction on salmon management measures. Right now, we'd be looking to take that up after H4, but of course, we'll be flexible and when we take that up, depending on how the salmon issues are developing. One other comment, I did receive a report of one case of COVID this morning among our salmon groups. So just letting you all know in case you feel the need to test or mask, now you're aware. So that's the end of my remarks, Mr. Chairman.
In season, moving up in season. All right, thank you very much. So without further ado, I'll pass the gavel to Vice Chair Pete Hassemer, who will take up E9.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, all. We're taking up E9, Klamath Dam removal update, and I will look to Robin Elke for an introduction to this item.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. This is agenda item E9, Klamath Dam removal update. The removal of the 4 dams on the Klamath River have been a topic of discussion since at least 2006, when the licenses issued to operate the dams expired. Most recently, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, approved the removal of the 4 dams on the Klamath River, which flows from South Central Oregon through Northern California to the Pacific Ocean. Dam decommissioning will include reservoir drawdowns and eventual deconstruction, which could begin in late 2023 or early 2024. Once the dams are removed, there will be hundreds of miles of accessible habitat for salmon and other species, and habitat restoration planning is underway. Removal of infrastructure will directly impact fishery monitoring efforts at monitoring stations and will impact fish out migration and returns. It will be important to understand how this might affect stock assessment and management, as well as sediment transport, water quality, and other issues. This update will help inform the council of the timeline and process for the dam removal and spur forward thinking on how the council may need to adjust to the loss of monitoring station and anticipate habitat changes that result from dam removal. Under this agenda item, Jim Simonday of the Klamath Branch Supervisor from NIMS will provide an update to the council on the status of the Klamath Dam removal project. It is anticipated that as the project progresses, additional updates may be warranted to ensure the council is kept informed of the status of the dam decommissioning, habitat improvements, and any unforeseen issues that may arise. The council is tentatively scheduled to further consider the issues described above as at the November 2023 meeting. So essentially the council action under here is just discussion. You do have reference materials. We'll have a presentation from Jim Simonday, and we have some advisory body reports as well. We have the STT, SAS, and the Habitat Committee providing reports for you under this agenda item. And that summarizes my report.
Thank you, Robin. Are there questions on the overview? And I don't see any questions. So because we're starting with the NIMS presentation, I will turn to Susan Bishop for introduction of that.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. As Robin said, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jim Simonday to the table to provide a presentation on Klamath status of Klamath Dam removal. Mr. Simonday is the branch chief of our Klamath branch in our Arcata office, and his branch is basically our lead on tracking and monitoring and assessing the effects on endangered species of the Klamath Dam removal, among many other things. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the introduction and the summary, Robin and Susan. Glad to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in person. I've been giving this presentation remotely here for the last couple of days, and it's meaningful to be here in person to share this information with you, because it's good to start a day with some optimism, and we have some optimism to share associated with this project that's been going on for quite some decades. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to provide you with an overview with some context of the Klamath Basin and why it's important, and a little bit about the project area as well, including the dams and the hatchery that currently exists. Provide a summary and timeline for the dam removal project, which is coming right up here. We're actually in the middle of it now. And I think of real interest to the council and its teams is the potential effects of dam removal to the Klamath stocks, with a focus on Klamath River fall Chinook and spring Chinook. I'll touch briefly on sunk coho salmon as well. And then I'll finish up with some information on future activities that are going to be interlinked to the dam removal project, those being the planning efforts, reintroduction, restoration, etc. Next slide, please. A little context to the Klamath Basin. You may be familiar with it, but if you're not, the basin is pretty much split in half between California and Oregon. The upper basin in the upper right portion of the diagram was home historically to large production of spring Chinook and fall Chinook salmon. It's a unique watershed in that some have described it as an upside down system, as the upper basin is eutrophic, high in nutrients, low gradient, but it also contains a lot of cold water refugia, which is really important as we think ahead to climate change and resiliency to our populations. It's a diverse range of stakeholders that exist in the Klamath Basin. Tribal communities relying on the fishery are up and down in the river. There's agricultural communities that rely on water availability for their products. They're centered around the Klamath Lake in the upper portion of the watershed, as well as in key tributaries like the Shasta and the Scott River below Iron Gate Dam. It's a mix of public, municipal, recreational uses, federal and non-federal lands. And what we can say about the Klamath Basin stakeholders is that they often find themselves in conflict over water resources, which have been very limited in the last couple of decades. Stressors that have driven the populations to where they are today include the dams, water diversions. As I mentioned, there's a lot of agriculture in the basin. Historically, mining, logging, fishing impacted production and fisheries over time. And of course, more recently, in the last couple of decades, we've seen the effects of climate change, where historically the basin, in the upper basin especially, relies on snowmelt-driven water for its hydrology. That's been shifted in the last few decades towards more of a rainfall-dominated system. Historically, the Klamath Basin was a large producer in the 48 states. On the West Coast, it was only third behind the Columbia and the Sacramento River. Historical estimates, approximately around 1 million fish at one time, 1 million salmon. And of course, it goes without saying that we all understand that the decline in the fishery has had critical consequences to our communities and the fisheries. Next slide, please. So the project is slated around 4 of the 6 existing dams in the Klamath River. In 1919, Copco 1 dam was constructed, effectively impacting access to the upper basin over 400 miles of habitat. That was followed by the Copco 2 dam construction. Third dam that was constructed was J.C. Boyle upstream of the Copcos. And then finally in 1962, Iron Gate Dam was constructed, which is where it is today. Note that in the lower left-hand portion of the photo on the left, you'll see that Iron Gate Hatchery sits at the base of Iron Gate Dam. It relies upon the cold water pool of Iron Gate Reservoir to provide production of those fish. And with dam removal, the hatchery will go away. So that's important for you to know. Next slide, please. The dams have had significant impact on our fishery. I mentioned the loss of habitat. Over 400 miles of anadromous habitat exists above Iron Gate. It's also had significant impacts to the populations below Iron Gate Dam as well. The dams alter the temperature regime of the river, and that's important when we think about how temperature plays a role in disease. Basically, the water is warmer in the late summer and early fall when adults return to the river, and it's colder in the springtime. What that means is that in the springtime, growth of juvenile Chinook is delayed, and they rear longer in the upper portion of the river, making them more susceptible to disease infection later in the spring. Additionally, in the early fall, with Klamath River Fall Chinook coming back to warm temperatures, those fish are impacted by the risks of ick and columnaris. The dams also block sediment. They impact flow variability. And when we think about the life history of Serrata novus Shasta, the disease that's had such a pronounced impact on juvenile Chinook in the Klamath River, we've basically created a perfect condition to allow that disease to proliferate. The photo second from the right is a photo of the substrate below Iron Gate Dam. Note that it's carpeted with annelid worms that serve as an intermediate host for Serrata novus Shasta. The lack of scouring potential and high flow events have provided that ideal condition for ceratомyxosis, which is observed in the fish on the far right with the distended bellies. The impact of this has been significant. In 2020, we lost over 75% of our Iron Gate hatchery release of Chinook to disease before those fish had the chance to actually enter the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. And of course, this has tremendous impact on returns. Note that in the last 7 of 8 years, we've missed our escapement goal of 40,000 fish. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the dam removal strategy. This strategy really dates back to the early 2000s during the FERC relicensing process. And in 2002, the landmark agreements, hydroelectric settlement agreement, which lays out a path for dam removal, and its companion document, the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, were signed. But in 2016, with a lack of congressional support, the KBRA expired and the dam removal process stalled. And really from the ashes of the KBRA came a creative and forward-thinking approach to amending the hydroelectric settlement agreement and creating a third party, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, to serve it as a new owner of the project for the sole purpose of decommissioning the dams. And that process is where we are today. This has been funded through efforts of PacifiCorp, through customer surcharges, Prop 1 monies, and contingency funds from both states of Oregon and California. And I point you to the website in the lower left portion, which provides a wealth of information for those who want to learn more about the dam removal process. Next slide, please. So we are well on our way to dam removal. The bullets that are grayed out indicate we have met those milestones. They include the transfer of the license. NMFS and Fish and Wildlife Service completed biological opinions in December 2021. The EIS has been issued. The license has been surrendered. And just last month, FERC gave us a notice to proceed. And what that means is there are trucks rolling today to the project site doing work. In fact, Fall Creek Hatchery, the new hatchery for the Klamath River, is being reconstructed as we speak. Looking ahead, we have some key milestones in our sites. Copco 2 will be removed. That's a smaller dam in the project area, will be removed this summer. Key date for your interest is January of 2024. That is the date when the tunnels will start to evacuate the water and the sediments collected in the reservoirs upstream. Before that date, fish that are currently and will be at Iron Gate Hatchery will be transitioned over to the Fall Creek Hatchery before the tunnels start to evacuate those sediments. Schedule for the removal of the existing 3 dams in 2024 is for the late spring, early summer during base flow conditions to allow the work to be done in time for volitional fish passage, which will occur in October of 2024 when fall Chinook return. And then looking ahead, the project extends out to 2032 for an 8-year period when operations at Fall Creek Hatchery will continue, reservoir restoration will continue, and reintroduction activities will continue as well. Next slide, please. So the hatchery, this will be interesting for you. The hatchery, as I mentioned earlier, the existing hatchery will be removed during dam removal. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife, in coordination with NMFS and tribes and other stakeholders, developed a new hatchery plan. That plan was centered around the existing Fall Creek Hatchery. There's reasons why we selected this as the preferred alternative. First and foremost, it has been used successfully in the Klamath River. It has produced very healthy, high survival rates of Chinook and coho salmon in years past, primarily because of the excellent water quality that exists there. There's also a secure water right that exists. And because there is a project there to work off of, it was selected. So Iron Gate Hatchery closes in 2023, transitions over to Fall Creek Hatchery. There's an adaptive management component to Fall Creek Hatchery, which includes alternate selections of broodstock so that there'll be opportunities to collect fish for the production goals. And the slide in the lower left is a construction photo of Iron Gate Hatchery in the early 60s. Center photo is a photo of the existing Iron Gate Hatchery, and lower right is the future design of Fall Creek Hatchery. Next slide, please. Just to orient you all on the locations, in the lower left-hand corner is Iron Gate Hatchery, and just downstream of Iron Gate Hatchery is an important tributary, Bogus Creek, which has high concentrations of natural and hatchery origin fish. That's important to know. Also, note Fall Creek Hatchery location upstream of Iron Gate Reservoir. The hatchery itself sits about 1 mile upstream from the confluence of the Klamath River. And I mentioned that we're going to be using alternate collection methods for broodstock. Not only do we anticipate fish returning to the Fall Creek ladder as fish have already been imprinted on that hatchery, but we'll also be using an auxiliary ladder at Iron Gate Hatchery, which will continue to function that purpose, as well as using a weir on Bogus Creek for broodstock. Next slide, please. So there is limited capacity at Fall Creek Hatchery. And as a result, we're not going to be able to meet all of the production goals that currently exist at Iron Gate Hatchery. Because of its importance to the conservation of the listed sonk coho salmon, the coho program has been prioritized and will continue to produce 75,000 yearlings. Production goals for Chinook will decrease, as you can see in the table above, approximately resulting in 50% of the current production goals. But be aware that while the production goals at Iron Gate Hatchery have been approximately 6 million fish, in the last 5 years, that average has been much less in terms of what actually has been released. The numbers have been much more closer to 3.8 million fish because of problems with production. The term for Fall Creek Hatchery is for 8 years. The KHSA identifies the responsibility of Pacificor to fund Fall Creek Hatchery for 8 years following dam removal. Beyond those 8 years, funding is uncertain at this time. The objective is to increase the percentage of fish tagged at Fall Creek Hatchery such that there'll be approximately the same amount of tags in the ocean as they currently exist. And I mentioned before, we have an adaptive management program, which includes extensive monitoring, and fish have already been reared at Fall Creek so that they're imprinted and are expected to return. Next slide. Now I'll turn my attention over to the impacts of dam removal. And the basis of this, back one, please. And the basis of this is our biological opinion, which I mentioned earlier, and our consultation on southern resident killer whales, in which we analyze the effects of dam removal on the non-listed Chinook stocks. Next slide. The effects can basically been broken out into short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And most of the impacts, the adverse impacts that is, are expected to occur in the first 1 or 2 years. Beyond that, we don't anticipate many adverse effects associated with dam removal. The effects include the impacts from releasing the sediment behind these dams. Between 1.2 and 2.7 million metric tons of sediment will be evacuated from these reservoir systems. These are mostly comprised of clay, silt, and organic materials. Because of their fine stature, they're expected to transfer out into the ocean, stay in suspension, and evacuate the system. But there will be some sediment that will remain in the system and deposit, which I'll discuss in a moment. But the greatest impacts to Chinook in terms of suspended sediment are anticipated during that drawdown period, which begins on January, and then pulses of sediment that will continue through the spring, dependent on the hydrology. One of the big uncertainties with this project is we don't know exactly what type of hydrology we'll have next year. Because Upper Klamath Lake has small storage capacity, it's possible that we could be in spill mode, but knowing the Klamath, it'll probably be another dry year. The greatest impacts occur when we have pulses of sediment released as a result of high flow events when fish are most exposed during peak outmigration periods. And so what NIMS did was look at a wide range of hydrologic conditions and analyzed the most severe conditions that we could to better understand what's the worst case scenario. And so the numbers I'm about to share with you are those worst case scenario numbers. In terms of impacts to, nope, back please. In terms of impacts to juveniles, fry, and smolts, potentially up to 17% of the population that's most proximal to Iron Gate Dam will be lost in the first year. As we travel downstream and there's more accretions to attenuate those impacts, 11% of the population will be lost as a result of high suspended sediment loads. By the time we're down to the middle Klamath, that number decreases all the way to 7%. And then as we get further down, certainly by the time we're at the Trinity River, that number is negligible. We don't anticipate those effects to extend into a second year unless it's a dry year. And then in a dry year, the impacts in the first year are going to be much less than the numbers I just shared with you. The other great impact is red suffocation. So I mentioned not all that sediment is going to remain in suspension. Some of that will be deposited, especially the first 5 miles of the main stem. We anticipate that reds that are constructed in the river over the first 5 miles below Iron Gate Dam will be lost. That number could comprise up to 13% of the main stem spawners in 2024. Beyond that, we don't anticipate mortality associated with reds. And of course, dam removal is a messy business. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around the tributaries that exist in the project area. Suspended sediment will be released at times. There'll be adverse effects to populations, but we don't anticipate population level impacts. Next slide, please. Looking ahead to a period before we start to realize the benefits of recolonization to the upper basin. And once we've kind of passed that window of the first 2 years of impacts, we wanted to know what likely will occur, especially given that hatchery production will be 50% of what it potentially could be now. So we used a tool called the Stream Salmonid Simulator, which is a spatially explicit tool and includes a submodel associated with the disease Ceratodonova shasta. And we assumed a couple of things here in this analysis. Because of dam removal and the sediment effects in the river, we expect it to be basically a reset button to the Serrata Nova Shasta life history. That sediment load and the disturbance of their habitat, the annelid worm, is going to likely result in extremely low prevalence of infection rates for quite some time. And so when you consider low POI, low prevalence of infection in the future with dams out versus what we've been experiencing, the results are actually more fish entering the estuary under dam removal, despite the reduction in hatchery production than currently exists. Next slide, please. But looking beyond that 8-year window with recolonization, we anticipate great things associated with the habitat that's upstream. Now, not all the habitat is pristine, but there's a lot of quality habitat that currently exists above Iron Gate Dam. Some of that habitat Coho will take advantage of, 76 miles of habitat, including key tributaries in the reservoir reach. They include Shovel Creek and Spencer Creek. These are cold water dominated systems. And the cold water dominated systems of the upper basin above Upper Klamath Lake, where Chinook salmon historically used, will provide great habitat as well for spring and fall Chinook. For example, there's springs that enter into the Klamath River in the J.C. Boyle Reach, approximately 200 CFS of cold water that's providing zero benefits to Chinook today, which we're anticipating is going to provide significant benefits, especially when we look ahead to the impacts of climate change and the need for resiliency of these populations. Next slide, please. The benefits will also extend downstream to the current populations. Because the dams are being removed, those tributaries that are currently blocked are going to provide advanced flow variability, which is extremely important, as well as we're going to maintain temperatures that are more consistent with the natural regime. Water quality is going to improve. For example, improvements to dissolved oxygen and blue-green algae reductions. And there's going to be benefits to channel form and function that will occur. Large wood that's currently blocked by these dams will provide habitat. Sediment will transport again through the system. And all of these are expected to result in lower disease rates in the future. Next slide. So there's been a number of publications that have considered what those benefits might be and what the capacity could be under dam removal. And many of these studies date back to the early 2000s during the Secretarial Determination Day. You'll see some numbers up there of up to 40,000 Chinook, potentially the habitat that's available, some lower, some higher. Next slide, please. And all of these publications have a common theme, which is kind of captured in the last bullet there from NIMS and Department of Interior, that under dam removal, we expect that be much greater improvements to production as compared to the current conditions with dams in place. Next slide. But in essence, how far dam removal provides in terms of restoration and repopulation will be dependent upon how well we restore those impacts that exist in the system. One of the criticisms of the Klamath Basin for many years has been there's been a lack of a comprehensive restoration plan that leads a roadmap to recovery and restoration of populations. And to address that concern, there's been documents that have been prepared in advancement of dam removal. The Integrated Fisheries Restoration and Monitoring Plan is a comprehensive plan, a basin-wide plan that lays out a strategy for restoration and monitoring And then the plan captured in the left-hand portion of this slide is a reservoir restoration prioritization plan. That's a detailed plan associated with restoration for those tributaries in the reservoir reach. And these are already paying dividends today, as there's $6 million of projects that are currently under review under funds, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and other funding resources that are currently looking at projects to help to restore these habitats. Next slide, please. There's also key plans that are being developed for reintroduction. Reintroduction is going to occur two ways: volitional and active. The plan right now is for only active reintroduction of spring Chinook to the upper basin. The rest will occur volitionally. The two plans have been developed by the states. The ODF&W plan is already being used right now, as we are in our second year of releasing spring Chinook to the upper basin in the tributaries above Upper Klamath Lake. And real interesting results associated with last year's release of 10,000 fish showed that they moved quickly through the system downstream into the Pacific Core project reach with fairly high survival rates as well. And there was actually one fish that was tagged that somehow made its way all the way to the mouth of the Klamath River. In California, CDF&W is finalizing their reintroduction plan, which includes a plan for expanding the monitoring for fisheries management purposes into the project reach as well. We expect